Good morning, everybody. Today I'm speaking to Dr. John Enders from the Institute of Race Relations, and the topic of discussion is the South African ambassador being expelled or soon to be expelled from the United States of America. So, John, welcome back to the channel.
Sorry, would you mind just restarting that?
Sure. So,
Sorry.
topic today is the South African ambassador being expelled from the United States or is soon to be expelled. And I'm speaking to Dr. John Enders from the Institute of Race Relations. And John, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you very much, Hugo.
So, just want to get your perspective. There's a few events that has occurred in the last few months. We can even go back as far as last year. I point to the root cause of the fallout as the South African case against Israel, the International Court of Justice, and then of course there was a lot of laws being passed in South Africa, or soon to be passed, the expropriation without compensation bill. And then this week, the South African ambassador did something rather undiplomatic, which is he accused the Trump administration of white supremacy at a security conference, Mpumbukwe Security Conference. I've never heard of this institute before. And Marco Rubio on Twitter, in reaction to an article written on Breitbart News, basically said the person is Ibrahim Rasool is persona non grata. Okay, so that's sort of the context of this. Anything to add to that before we get to details?
Yeah, maybe just the institute that Rasul was doing a webinar with is the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. And
Hmm.
that's sort of an ANC-linked think tank, I think led by Joel Netshitenze. And the fact that you haven't heard of it before is, I think, emblematic of the fact that its impact has not been very visible. So typically, you'll probably see some government people speaking there, but otherwise, it's not really very present in the media.
Okay, that's interesting. So, what do you make of the whole situation? Was Marco Rubio right for kicking out Ibrahim Rasool? Is this undiplomatic on the US side? And what about
Mhm.
Ibrahim Rasool's rather naivety, I would say?
Yeah, so I think it's maybe makes sense to embed this in the greater context and to understand what's going on there. I think it's helpful to look at something which James Myberg, the editor of Politics Web, wrote a few days ago, where he suggested that when you look at ANC communication, it's actually happening at two different, what he calls channels, at two different
Mm,
frequencies. And for domestic audiences, what ANC and government communication is about is that, as James writes, chanting "kill the Boer" is fine. The National Democratic Revolution demands demographic representativity, so we've got transformation all over the country. Seizing of land, also fine. And also, he writes, we will sell SA's foreign policy to any dictatorship willing to pay high enough a price. And then, there's been sort of a few historical incidents where autocratic regimes have supported the ANC, especially ahead of elections with donations. And so that's what happens domestically. That's how the ANC presents itself. But on the international stage, it presents itself quite differently. And that's where it sort of, aims for maximum respectability. And for international consumption, the message is we are the leaders of the Rainbow Nation. We are fanatically committed to reconciliation and non-racialism. And our foreign policy is guided by our fierce commitment to human rights. And so he's
right.
got these two different channels. And what seems to be happening here is that the Trump administration is now tuned into the domestic channel. So they're actually ignoring all this international relations communication, which is all about respectability and cooperation and human rights and sustainability, etc., etc. They're ignoring all of that and they're looking at the domestic communication. And they're saying, for all your high flying language and moral language on the international stage, dear ANC, we're looking at your policies domestically and they're terrible. You've got unemployment at over 30%. Your economy isn't growing. You're applying race discrimination across the whole country to private companies, state entities. You're really not doing very well. Plus, you also are um, linked into the whole idea of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which in the South African context is transformation and representativity. That's something we're not buying into. It's something we're removing out of our country. And we're seeing this big non-alignment, misalignment between the US and South Africa. And so that's the underlying tension that's been building up over time. South Africa then sends Ibrahim Rasool as the ambassador to the United States. I think it was about 2 months ago or so. And coming in this context, was Rasul a good appointment? Is the question. And because he's had this closeness to Hamas and to the Iranians, um, that's not a very popular position to represent in Washington at the moment. And when he then gave the Americans an excuse by making the comments that he did in that seminar, I think they immediately said, we're just going to kick this guy out. We're actually not interested in dealing with him.
I want to sort of latch onto a few things there with Iran and Hamas, which needs to be stated. I'm married to an Iranian woman, as my audience would know, and I speak a bit of Persian. Now, to give the listeners an idea of how irrelevant South Africa is to Iran, when I
Hmm.
got married, they didn't know it was a country. None of my family knew it was a country. Okay,
Yeah.
we're not on the radar of Iranian foreign policy, whatever you believe of the Israeli stance.
Hmm.
Whether or not South Africa took money from Iran, which has been alleged before the election. I know there was dodgy bookkeeping within the ANC, so I don't exclude the possibility. I've personally been skeptical of that story. I just it doesn't add up. But if it does, it is what it is. It won't shock me either, right?
Hmm.
But in terms of ANC tactics, whether or not it is wise, and I want to get your view on it, to infuriate your largest trading partner, second largest trading partner, to rename the streets of the U.S. embassy in Johannesburg after a Palestinian liberation fighter, let's call him that.
Hmm.
Whether it was wise to confront Israel at the ICJ. I'm personally very sympathetical to the Palestinian cause, but I remember an exchange I had with Kwedi Mantashe before this came up, and I asked him for cost-benefit analysis, and it occurred to me the ANC never considered the possibility of doing one.
Hmm.
Whatever your view is. So, just the incompetent statecraft on foreign policy, I think, sort of the collected name. If you can maybe just speak to that a bit as to how did the ANC think this was going to end up well for them?
Yeah. So, I mean, the ANC, I think, has not really been inclined to moderate its position on the United States, despite the growing unhappiness of the United States with South Africa's politics. And if you think back to about 2 weeks ago, there was a piece in Foreign Policy magazine, co-authored by President Ramaphosa and three other authors, that was highly critical of the role that the United States plays in international politics, especially relating to Israel and the international organizations. And this was, kind of like a provocation of the United States at a moment when the relationship was already tense. And so that, I think, leads me to support what you're saying, which is that our foreign policy is often not well conceived in terms of anticipating the reaction of your counterpart and then adapting your actions in anticipation of that response from your counterpart. So we sort of seem to do things hoping for the best, or maybe just because we think it's what's right, but maybe not really seeing what's coming down the line. And when we look at South Africa's relationship with the United States, I think we're going to see quite a few things still coming down the line. There's been this talk about AGOA being cancelled. There's now been talk about targeted sanctions against certain individuals and organizations in South Africa.
Mm.
A friend of mine asked, what would be the next step of escalation after the ambassador has been declared persona non grata, especially as the provocations from South Africa are continuing with the renaming of Santon Drive to Lila Khaled Drive, and that's the road that the US consulate sits on. They're not going to want to have letterheads with the name of what they consider to be a Palestinian terrorist being sent out. So what could they do? And one of the things that could happen is that they downgrade the diplomatic relationship with South Africa, and they say, "Look, we're closing the embassy in South Africa. This is not a country that we want to have a presence in. We will ask maybe the Swiss embassy to provide services." Sorry, my connection, I think, just dropped there for a
Yeah,
moment.
you stopped there at the Swiss embassy. That's the last time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Swiss embassy might be asked to provide services on behalf of the Americans, or possibly the Americans will say that the embassy in Windhoek will now be responsible for managing, affairs in the
I
Southern
was
African
thinking of
region.
the Swaziland one would be more appropriate because that's how the
Yes,
Taiwanese deal with South Africa.
yes. Or Lesotho, which Mr. Trump asked if that was even a country. And so, yes. that would be an option. So there's further steps of escalation in this. So people have been saying this expulsion of the South African ambassador represents the low point in the relationship. I think that's true, but I don't think it's going to remain true because it's certainly possible for this relationship to go even further down.
Look, if South Africa inevitably threatens America, I don't think we're a threat to them, fortunately.
Yeah.
I don't even rule out coup d'etats. I mean, it has gone that that far down the route in the past, right? But
Mm.
before we get there, I think there will be a lot more diplomatic leverage being used. I mean, you spoke to AGOA. What is the current status of AGOA? Is it still in act, in effect, or
Yeah, it's still in effect. It's up for renewal. Um, and the question is whether South Africa gets included in the countries that benefit from it. Does South Africa qualify? And I think it is acting in sort of outright opposition to American national interests that it will be hard to justify keeping the benefits for South Africa. Plus, also another fact that hasn't been that much commented on, but which might turn out to be important, is that AGOA is a law passed by the US Congress.
right?
And one of the requirements that are in the opening sections is that beneficiaries of AGOA must protect property rights or show progress towards strengthening property rights. And so they
Cool.
could say, look, you guys just passed the Expropriation Act. You're not strengthening property rights. You're doing the opposite. And therefore, you're no longer qualified. So I think there's quite a few reasons why South Africa might lose this benefit. That is not going to impact a high percentage of our international trade directly, but I think it is going to have a big impact on certain sectors, including very important ones like automotive, for example. So we've got automotive manufacturing in South Africa. A lot of that is done here for export into the United States because it benefits from no tariffs. But if tariffs suddenly start to be introduced on car exports from South Africa to the United States, then that is maybe not a competitive business anymore. And that could lead to the withdrawal of investment, the shutting of plants, with ripple effects through the secondary industries, the suppliers to the automotive industries, and quite a large number of job losses. So I think the withdrawal of AGOA would be quite a significant thing.
Um, to what extent would the South African government interpret these as sanctions? I mean, these aren't really sanctions. These are cutting up trade agreements. You could say, okay, we're charging market price now, if you will, for things.
Yeah.
Um, but it's already we're seeing the language, and I'm very familiar with this language because it happened in both Zimbabwe and in Iran, where
Mm.
any action by a foreign power against the country is being seen as sanctions, and then the leadership of that country, as opposed to owning up responsibility, they deflect and they say
Yeah.
that is the responsibility for all the suffering that is occurring within the country.
Yeah, exactly. So you get like a sort of a battle to dominate the narrative. Like, how do you explain these events? And I think that in terms of AGOA, if it was stopped, if South Africa's participation was stopped, the right way to look at it would actually be the withdrawal of a benefit rather than the imposition of a sanction. Similarly, as it was with the cutting of the aid. So if the United States cuts aid to South Africa, that's actually not a sanction. It is the withdrawal of a benefit. And if you think about how benefits work, you sort of you should at least be grateful for the benefits that you're receiving, or show some sort of accommodation for the donor's generosity. And if you're not doing that, then why are you getting the benefit? And I think that's very much the mindset of the Americans at the moment, that they're saying, we're showering South Africa in this case with benefits like AGOA and aid and attention. But as a matter of fact, this is not being reciprocated. So why are we doing this? Let's stop it. And then they stop it.
There is a tragedy to this story, which is if you look at the Trump administration, people go on about what is called the Israeli lobby, and there's some truth to that. But there's also a South African lobby around them at the moment. Elon Musk being the obvious example. Peter Thiel grew up in Namibia when it was still under South African occupation. There's a lot of people in that entourage that are actually South African.
Mm.
And if the South African administration were to play its cards right, you would get that investment to flow both
Mm.
ways.
Yeah.
But how, I mean, where we're standing at the moment, that seems distance away. I mean, how would one move towards that direction?
Yeah. I think that's a really great point. Like, what is the upside potential? What can be achieved? And I think there is massive upside potential, because My view on the South African economy is that it's actually very capable of fast growth and of attracting investment because it's got a lot of things going for it. But it does need the brakes to be taken off. And those brakes are, in many cases, policy brakes and legislative brakes, like threats to property rights, like race-based policies across employment and procurement, like sort of sanctions on investment in a way. If you say that people have to give up equity in order to be allowed to invest in South Africa, you actually, you know,
Yeah.
you're imposing a tariff on investment, which is crazy in a world of very low investment levels in South Africa. But if you were to
So,
do this, I think you could
yeah.
create this atmosphere of optimism and investment into South Africa.
But what is the possibility of the ANC giving up on it? I mean, I can still see them backtracking on expropriation without compensation, watering down legislation. They've done that to some extent already.
Mm.
Um, but race-based laws, which many of them benefit from, I mean, is that even a possibility?
I think it's very, very tough, to actually do that. But I think it is going to turn out to be a question of survival for the ANC. And facing extinction focuses the mind. And I do think that the ANC is going to face extinction if it doesn't get its act together. Now, not immediately, but already we're seeing big signs of weakening in public support for the ANC. We're seeing it under pressure from many quarters in terms of its policies. And if it doesn't reform, then its support is going to continue declining, and it will become tougher and tougher for it to play an important role in South Africa's development. So if it wants to maintain its influence, it actually has to choose this path of performance and effectiveness and getting the economy to grow. And that means, hard as it is, stepping away from those threats to property rights and race-based policies.
Mm. Let's point out to the other issue, which is the the Israeli case at the International Court of Justice. There are now several countries that's taken Israel to court, Ireland, including many Latin American countries, can call it former colonial countries. And they obviously have sympathy for the Palestinians, often been blinded to, I would argue, what Hamas is, but be that as it may, is it still necessary for South Africa to engage in that issue? I mean,
Good question. Again, I think like there's a lot of emotional investment there, as is the case with race-based policies and with the Expropriation Act. And overcoming that emotional investment and stepping away from it, that's a big ask. Um, and maybe the only way to really get to that is going to be on the basis of it's a question of survival. You've got to make the right calls to be successful. And in this context, it's also worth talking about the relationship between South Africa and the EU. So we had
yeah,
a very high-level meeting between the EU and South Africa earlier this week, in which the EU committed 4 point, I think, 7 billion euros in funding to South Africa, and
in
is clearly
loans.
very keen. Say again?
In loans, let's not
In
forget
loans,
that.
exactly. Yes, exactly. And that is, I think, a symbol of the EU trying to take the place of the United States as a preferred partner. And that is going to allow South Africa to avoid making the hard choices for a little longer that it needs to make to be successful. And in that way, I think it's a bit counterproductive. Also, in the sense that you say, I think out of those 4.7 billion euros, about 300 million are grants, and
Yeah.
4.4 billion are loans. And South Africa is already highly indebted at 76.3%, I think, of GDP. So we're adding more more loans to the debt pile that we have to pay back. And it's not for necessarily investment into growth driving initiatives. It's going to be a lot of
These are
green
these are
energy
all
and so.
they're all political projects. Whether we need more energy in South Africa, I've had a view for some time. Once Eskom is fixed, you probably don't. You probably have enough
Mm,
already. But be that as it may, that's maybe there's a businessman making some money out of it. It won't surprise me if there's a business opportunity.
mm,
The other issue here is BRICS. Now, Sergei Lavrov of Russia gave a very insightful interview with it was Dr. Andrew Napolitano, if I pronounced his name correctly,
mhm.
2 days ago. And in that interview, and it was a lot about US-Russian relations, he said a lot of countries don't respect human rights. South Africa is currently not respecting human rights, including property rights. This is Lavrov,
Really?
yes, the
Wow.
Russian foreign minister. So it would seem to me that even the BRICS countries, if I read through the lines, are saying guys, it's not on. A few days
Mhm.
ago, Russian embassy in South Africa made a gesture to the Russian Afrikaner Corporation during the Anglo-Boer War. Now you can say, okay, that's just a day of remembrance, but as you know, these things are always done for political purposes. So the question is, what is going on?
Mhm. Well, I think one thing that is going on is that under the impact of the Trump administration, there's a very rapid and massive shift happening in global priorities with a refocusing on the question of your effectiveness. So you think of Elon Musk's memo first to Twitter employees and more recently now to government employees saying, what did you get done last week? And that is a question that's being asked of countries as well. And if you haven't got a good answer to that question, you don't get respect. So the Russians are going to ask the South Africans, like, what did you get done last week? What is your unemployment rate? What is your economic growth rate? What's your investment rate? What's your industrial capacity? And on all of these questions, South Africa has to say we're doing badly and becoming worse. So you don't get respect because you're not being effective. And that really is like the critical point. How do you become effective as a nation? And I think if you become effective, then you can have good relationships with other countries, including the United States. The United States doesn't want to deal with a country that's going downhill and just not being very, very, very successful.
Well, it was a few years ago where the Chinese ambassador to South Africa said something similar. I can't remember the exact date,
Yes.
but he wrote an article which was it's undiplomatic and from a Chinese perspective. They barely ever criticized, where they said, essentially, we can't put money down in your country.
Yeah.
You know, something like that. It seems Russia is now saying something similar. The United States is saying something similar. So the South African government must come to terms with the fact this is not a Western Trump white supremacy response, which is now being tried to frame that, or that Trump is getting misinformation. Because the question would be, is Sergei Lavrov getting the same? Is AfriForum
Hmm.
also visiting Moscow? I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
It's they are seeing the country for what it is. It is investment. It's scaring away investment, basically.
Yes, exactly. And this is like this channel one and channel two communication. Like more and more countries are no longer listening to that diplomatic foreign relations channel, which just doesn't seem very realistic compared to what's going on in the country. And so that includes, that was a good observation. The Chinese ambassador a few years ago, now the Americans, the Russians as well, they're basically all saying the same thing, saying, get your act together. What's going on? Um, was hoping to still read you like a little quote from the South African response to the expulsion
So
of
the South
Rasul.
African response, and maybe we should talk a bit about this. Is also the story of AfriForum. Now the theory is that AfriForum has gone to the US and knocked on a few doors, and this is the source of Trump's information.
Mm-hmm.
Again, is AfriForum a better source of information than the Central Intelligence Agency? I would not bet on that.
Yeah,
But
yes.
I
Yeah, well,
mean,
they do have a bit of research capacity in Washington, so I think they're not going to rely on a single source to be informed. But yeah, they're going to listen to the AfriForum guys, because I'll say they're an important role player. We need to understand what their concerns are, and they're going to sort of cross correlate it against other information sources, against government statements as well, but also against statistical resources. What do the numbers say about the state of the country?
yeah. I mean, you just look at the current account; it tells you most of what's going on in the moment. So it's not a it's not a very good thing. Um,
Mhm.
let's sort of just go back to the if you haven't found the code, go back to the situation at the moment. So Ibrahim Rasool is now set to leave on Monday. It is now Sunday, so it's tomorrow actually. He has to fly back or pack his bags. Um,
No, I
if
think
you were to
he's got time until the 21st, until Friday.
oh, it's 21st. Okay, so it's
Yeah,
next
so they're
Monday.
withdrawing his diplomatic
Okay.
privileges by tomorrow and then asking him to leave by Friday.
Okay, so they're actually giving him time. So it's not that they're just kicking him out of the country.
A little
Um,
bit of time, yeah.
What should Ramaphosa do at the moment? The DA has been proposing a delegation, a GNU delegation to the United States. Is that going to work?
Um, I think not. I think that's actually also another good question. Like, what can the government do? And I think what it's going to take, firstly, is probably some public statements about its positioning ahead of sending a delegation. Because I think a delegation in the current circumstances is just going to be ignored. I don't think it will be received at all. Um, So yeah, I think like something has to happen here first before there will be doors opening to the South Africans that side.
Well, the best thing I would reckon they can do is to stop stop with these laws, move in the direction of policy reform.
Yeah.
But that seems to be a little bit far away from where we are at the moment.
Well, think about the impasse over the budget. Right, so
Mm.
that's like a domestic conflict that's brewing at the moment. The ANC has tabled a budget that proposes a 1 percentage point increase in the VAT rate over a course of 2 years. The DA, sorry, I just cut out there for a moment.
You
The
said the
DA,
DA was, yeah.
yeah, the DA is not supporting that. They don't want to do it. And without the votes of the DA and some other parties as well, you haven't got the majority to pass the various pieces of legislation that make up passing the budget. And I think the DA's demands to support the tax increase are going to be growing over time. And they're going to include the kinds of things that would spark growth in South Africa, or at least, open the opportunity for growth, like reducing threats to property rights, like reducing race-based policy, like taking another look at the NHI, etc., etc. So you're getting both this domestic pressure within our local political system, plus the pressure from the outside, from the United States, and now most recently from Russia as well, all acting in the same direction, telling the ANC, you've got to get your act together. And at some point, in the face of declining polling numbers, maybe the ANC is going to listen to that and say, actually, we do have a massive problem, and we've got to do something about it. But it is a big step to take. So let's see if they're able to take that step.
Well, there's another factor which plays in the back of this, which is the majority of South Africans were born after 1994. Um, the median age of the country, if I'm not mistaken, is 25, 26, something of that
Hmm.
nature. Um, it's also just the case that that older generation of ANC leadership and support base is dying out as we are speaking. And
Hmm.
by the next election, there will be a younger body politic and a more urbanized society, which is
Yeah,
another factor that plays into that. So, how do you speak to those observations?
I think that's true. So it's true both of the ANC as a party, but also true of the voters. So if you look at polling information, but you also, just looking anecdotally at comments under tweets, on X or YouTube videos, or the social media platforms, you can see a lot of these probably young, probably black commentators, just being fed up with the state of the country and where it's gone, and not being supportive of ANC policy. The South African voters are not buying what the ANC is selling. So if the ANC doesn't change the product, then voters are going to go elsewhere. They're going
Well,
to
I
vote for
would
somebody else.
recall there was one telling interview which Ramaphosa did on the Newsroom Africa, and I get into it with him some from time to time. And it was one of the commentators before the election. He said, "But we had so many women now on social grants," and she said to him, "But are you proud of that?"
Yeah,
Was the response, and he had nothing to say to it. And I thought that was
yeah.
so telling of, uh, especially black women. Right? It's been astonishing how they've stood up to the ANC in the last few years.
Mm,
And I don't think they have an answer to the criticism. I mean, because they could always deflect the white vote. They could say it's racist, it's apartheid longing, all these things.
yeah.
It's a bit more difficult when it comes from your own population.
Yes, exactly. And the population is asking the effectiveness question. So it's the same question that Trump is asking is being asked by the voters, which is, where are the jobs? Where are the services in education, health, water, electricity, infrastructure? And where's the safety? Why are we not being kept safe? Why is the murder rate so high? Why is the crime rate so high? Why are you not being effective in addressing these things that we care about?
Okay. So, just sort of your last thoughts on the diplomatic relations, if you were to sort of guess what would happen in the next few months. So what would South Africa react and how would America react?
So I think that currently I'm not seeing really an ability on the part of the GNU, or let's call it the ANC-led GNU, to formulate an effective response to this. So I think the relationship is not going to improve. I think, as a matter of fact, it may deteriorate further. Just picture a situation where Joel Pollack, who's been rumored to become the next ambassador to South Africa, is appointed and gets booted out immediately in a tit for tat move. Gets declared persona non grata
Oh,
as soon as he sets foot on South African soil. That's possible. The Americans could also downgrade the diplomatic relationship. I'm sure they've got ways of doing that. They can, impose these targeted sanctions. They can talk about AGOA, and I think that's basically the path we're on until the ANC, has a proper think about it and formulates a more successful strategy. In the meantime, while this deterioration continues, the ANC is going to seek solace in the arms of other partners, the EU among them, maybe also China, maybe also Russia, maybe BRICS countries, and is going to try to reorient its foreign policy away from the United States and towards countries that it sees as being more sympathetic to it.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to leave it there, Dr. John Enders. Thank you very much for the conversation, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you.